Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. Vaccination is a life-saving step in order to fight against certain types of crippling diseases. As our world changes and becomes more interconnected than ever, and as we face a global pandemic, the importance of vaccines cannot be emphasized enough. On today's show, we take a look at what goes into the process of creating a vaccine, carrying out trials, and making it commercially viable and accessible to the plenty. Joining us for this discussion today is Prof. Johnston, who's a clinical pharmacologist, joining us from London. Also joining us today is Dr. Siddharth Sridhar, who's a clinical assistant professor at the Department of Microbiology at the University of Hong Kong. He joins us from Hong Kong. Thank you both for joining us and taking out the time for the show today. Professor Ethel Johnston, I'd like to begin with a more general beginning and a general premise. For quite some time now, for a couple of years, we've been seeing an attack on vaccinations, and not coming from developing nations, but some of the most high-income countries. Do you feel like that trend is going to change after what we're seeing unfold in front of our eyes these days?
Well, I hope so. This anti-vaccination program that people have been leading and been advocating is just scientific madness. I'm sitting at St. George's University in London, where Jenner did his groundbreaking work on the vaccination for smallpox. And without that, we'd have a lot more people in the world killed. Right.
And as you're sitting in London, UK right now, we have a lot of questions coming about how the government is handling the current pandemic right now. Is there a wider sense of the beliefs that the Prime Minister has also being something that's supported by the wider population in terms of medical science?
Well, it's certainly supported by medical science, and it's being supported by the wider population. London looks like a ghost town at the moment, certainly central London. Very few people moving about, and a lot less crowded than I would normally expect it to be on a Wednesday.
Right. Dr. Sridhar, listen to you now. As we've talked about how in recent years there is a context in which there are people moving against vaccinations. Let's talk about why it's so essential to talk about the benefits of vaccinations. What kind of diseases do vaccines protect us from?
Right. Actually, vaccines protect us against a huge variety of diseases. As was mentioned, smallpox is a historic evidence of how important vaccination was to eradicate a disease off the face of the planet. And similarly, we see that with polio, in which the world is pushing towards eradication of poliomyelitis, which is a devastating disease in many countries in the world. And not just these, we think about infections that were once so common: measles, mumps, rubella, even chickenpox, and not to mention a variety of bacterial illnesses like Streptococcus pneumoniae or bacteria causing severe meningitis. We've got vaccines coming out against this, and they've done a world of good. So I guess the world, many countries, especially in the West, who had this strong anti-vaccination movement, I think many people in these countries would be strongly re-evaluating their stance, because what the world is waiting for now is a vaccine against COVID-19.
Right. We're talking about them reevaluating their stance now because of the evidence that's in front of us, because of the circumstances that are in front of us. They're truly crippling in every sense of the word. But let's move back and talk about why people lost faith in vaccines to begin with.
Let's take the example of the measles vaccine. In the late 90s, there was this extremely damaging scientific report that came out in a very reputable medical journal called The Lancet. So it was the first author was an academic called Andrew Wakefield, in which he claimed that the vaccine against measles could cause autism in children. Now, that claim has been debunked. It has been challenged by a number of high-quality studies subsequently, but you still have people holding on to this conspiracy theory. Now, starting from that, a variety of vaccines, especially those given to children as part of the universal vaccination program, have been challenged on various levels. So you ask people, I mean, they all know theoretically vaccines do confer a benefit, but at the back of the mind, because they've heard about so many things on social media or so many things from their friends, they really have a suspicion that we don't understand the full effects of vaccines. But there's no doubt, in my mind at least, for the common childhood vaccinations that we give, they've done a world of good and very little harm.
Right. That's the essential thing to remember in this conversation, that the benefits outweigh any doubts or the harm. And especially in the way we're moving forward, it's essential for research and development to be geared and to be mobilized in order to find solutions to some of the most crippling diseases in the world. Professor Atul Johnston, now talking about the development process of a vaccine and just going to the very initial stage of it. When a new disease breaks out, what are some of the bits of information that are firstly needed to start and begin the process of developing a vaccine?
Well, you need to identify the causative agent in the first place, which might seem simple, but actually in some cases can be quite difficult. Then that is inoculated into chick cells, and material is harvested from that, and the vaccine comes from that, is grown from that chick cell, or comes out of the processing that chick cell. It takes somewhere between 6 and 36 months, depending on how it's done, and about 70% of the time actually spent on ensuring the quality of the vaccine, testing it, making sure it's okay. We have improved vaccine production recently. Now we use mammalian cells, we use genetic engineering to produce hybrid cells or hybrid material, which does improve production. Right. And makes it, I think, easier to produce and more rapid.
Right. We're going to take this conversation step by step to really break down how this process, this very complicated process, can be understood by the majority of us. Dr. Sridhar, just moving back a little about what are the bits of information that are needed in order to develop a vaccine. Is it possible, and this is a lot that we're hearing these days, that in order to preempt certain diseases, there's always research and development going on at the back end that extrapolates from different cases in order to possibly come up with vaccinations before the disease comes? Is this complete misinformation, or are there processes in place that allow this to happen?
Basically, we need to know the disease, the pathogen first, right? So once there is a new disease like COVID-19, we know that this is a disease and it's caused by a particular pathogen, which is the SARS coronavirus 2, then we have a target for which we can start developing a vaccine. The mechanisms for producing the vaccine, the science behind it, are very much in place because we do essentially the same thing for this virus we have done so many times in the past. So it's a matter of replicating that process, but that can take a long period of time, as was just mentioned, up to more than a year.
Right. And in the development phases, what are some of the hindrances that companies, experts, and scientists face?
Right. For some diseases, the significant hindrance is there a financial incentive? Because drug companies want there to be a financial incentive to produce vaccines. So in this case, in the case of COVID-19, there's no doubt about it. There's a strong financial incentive and a humanitarian incentive, not to be too cynical about it. But for some diseases that are perhaps only found in very few parts of the world, there might be a financial hindrance right from the get-go, in that people can't get funding to develop vaccines because too few people actually get those infections for it to be financially viable. Now, if the funding is in place, then it's about producing a good product. There are a number of ways to design vaccines. Although in theory, it's very simple. You get a little bit or the whole virus or bacteria, and you just inject it into someone in a way that it doesn't cause an infection, but it produces a immune response. But there are so many variables and there are so many ways of doing that. And it's a matter of pinning down the best approach for a particular pathogen.
Right. Dr. Sridhar, to interrupt here, but stay with me on that point because I want to come back to something you said, but I want to get Professor Athol Johnston's viewpoint on this as well. The financial incentive that Dr. Sridhar just mentioned here, how have you seen this been working out in recent years? How strong is this financial incentive to actually begin the development and the research process? Does it actually pose a very viable threat to the production of life-saving vaccines?
I mean, the financial incentive is always there for production of anything. Really, it's not a financial incentive so much as it's just been said, it's a number of people who are affected by the disease and whether it's actually worth the effort of producing a vaccine for it. And we've been trying for years to produce a vaccine for malaria, a vaccine for AIDS, and we haven't succeeded because it's been quite difficult. And there's other diseases like dengue and Zika, which we're certainly looking at producing a vaccine for, and because it's affecting a large number of people. But if you've only got a small number of people, it won't be financially viable, and actually it won't be viable in terms of the research effort you have to put in to develop a vaccine like that. It isn't simply that pharmaceutical companies are greedy and want the money. It's a fact of life. You need money to do things.
Right, you need money to do this, and we're talking about the of the problem in order to take the research and development and all the efforts and invest it into creating that vaccine. Professor Athol Johnston, let's talk a little more about the information sharing that's involved in this process, understanding how pharmaceutical companies work in this regard. Now, in an urgent situation like the one that we're seeing right now, how critical is it for experts all around the world to let go of information wars and weaponizing information in a way and work together to develop something? Is that something that big pharmaceutical companies that have always worked for a financial incentive are doing right now?
I think you'll find that most of the basic research is coming from universities, and if not freely available, is certainly readily available. And there's conversations between academics throughout the world exchanging information. It takes the resources of a pharmaceutical company to actually produce the vaccine, but the basic research can be done in the university or a not-for-profit organization.
Right. So, So, Dr. Sridhar, when we're talking about MX and universities being at the forefront of research and development, when will the process be taken to pharmaceutical companies for actually the production of this?
So basically, you need to develop your approach, and you need some promising pilot data that it is reasonably scalable, that it is a reasonably effective method, that it actually works in a pilot group of individuals who have received the vaccine. And that can be done entering into a collaboration with the pharmaceutical companies. So as what was just mentioned, the initial approaches would be done at academic levels and is already being done by universities throughout the world, as we've been hearing, are developing promising vaccine strategies. And then when it comes to actual production and in a scalable fashion, then you need the pharmaceutical companies on board to actually make that happen because of their massive resources and distribution capabilities.
Right. And as we're talking about the trial, the success of a trial and then collaborating with pharmaceuticals, let's talk about that in greater depth. What does the trial entail? You mentioned a little about injecting vaccinations, prototypes in certain people without causing them to react in a sort of manner. What are some of the protocols that are observed during this process? How is sampling done? How are people selected as trials?
Right. The first step, after everything is done, the approach is kind of perfected to a certain extent. Then we would tend to administer it to animals first. So these would be laboratory animals and try to demonstrate the efficacy of the approach in an animal model for the coronavirus, on which many academics throughout the world are working. If the data and all that is promising, then we might make a decision to progress to evaluate the vaccine safety in healthy volunteers. And we would also need to do a trial to determine the optimal dosage, the optimal route of administration of the vaccine. And then we would start looking at the features of efficacy, like we look at how strong the antibody response is against the virus in people who are challenged to the vaccine. And then you finally come to the stage of actually doing clinical trials involving hundreds of thousands of individuals to see how effective the vaccine is in a real life setting. And that is why the process is so long, because there's a lot of work required for development, optimization, ensuring the safety and ensuring the efficacy of the vaccine before it's actually available for mass production and mass distribution.
Professor Athol Johnston, talking of experts and scientists, there is this understanding that this entire process that Dr. Sridhar mentioned to us, that he talked to us about different stages, it's being accelerated, especially with the circumstances we have right now. What does that process being accelerated look like?
I think the issue is it's being accelerated, but don't believe that corners are being cut. It's just some of the administrative processes have been accelerated and shortened, but all the same processes will have to go through. Well, you will have to go through this, all the same processes you would, the safety processes and the checks and balances of that. But these will be accelerated rather than cut. So it isn't a question of reducing safety or efficacy. Right. It just means it will be done quickly. And there's been no administrative blocks put in the way of doing this.
Right. Dr. Sridhar, is that we're seeing right now that administrations are taking a step back? Now, the process being accelerated, as Professor Athol Johnston mentioned, means that the administration, the bureaucratic procedures of all of it are shortened. Is that what we're seeing happening? Are governments doing that at this point in time?
I have seen that even in Hong Kong, where very early on when this emerged as a threat, there were calls put out by funding agencies, like if you want to do vaccine research, there are actually more funding opportunities available. They would give you their decision on whether or not you get the funding much quicker. And then once there's a product in place, or once there's a potential vaccine that you have developed, the regulatory approval required for performing clinical trials, which normally might take a long period of time, that would be expedited in a way. So people are making decisions on things faster. So it's not just the science that takes time, it's basically the administrative or the bureaucratic processing that goes on behind it that also takes a lot of time. And that, when we're facing a global pandemic or a global emergency, all of that would hopefully be much shortened. And we are seeing that as well at the moment.
Dr. Sridhar, just one last question about what you mentioned, funding being mobilized. The manner in which funds are being raised, is that unprecedented? Is it unprecedented given the situation, given the gravity of the situation right now?
I would say it is unprecedented in certain ways, because the world is a different place today than it was the last time we had a major pandemic, say in 2003 in SARS or 2009 in the case of pandemic flu. Because you have so many research institutes around the world that have developed in this period of time, so many new academic institutions, especially in East Asia, where this COVID-19 pandemic actually began, and have actually developed over this period of time. So our capacity for performing high-quality research has greatly increased as well, especially in this part of the world. And so the funding has grown exponentially in step with that, especially in mainland China.
Right, and that's, of course, very positive news in terms of how fast we're moving to develop these vaccinations. Thank you so much, Dr. Sridhar, for joining us, and Professor Athol Johnston for joining us from London. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. What we're talking about today is the role of vaccinations, how important they are. But more importantly, we're also discussing the development procedure, how it's being changed all around the world, given that we're in the midst of a pandemic. Now, joining us for this conversation is Dr. Mohammad Munir, who's a virologist at Lancaster University. He joins us from Lancaster. Also joining us is Mr. Azmat Majeed, who's a consultant clinical and therapeutic nutritionist. He joins us from Lahore. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Dr. Mohammad Munir, let me begin with you. Now, before we went to break, we talked about how the structure has changed, especially when it comes to funding. Since the last pandemic, when we're talking about research and development moving towards the creation of a vaccine, how do you see this procedure being done differently this time around?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think there are a few things that happen very positively in the scientific community for the welfare of the public health. For instance, there is an organization called SAPI, which is a coalition partly funded by the World Health Organization. They've been working since Ebola outbreak. So those being pumped with a massive amount of money, and they started an emergency call to really bring up the expertise and the proven and existing technologies to cut short onto the time for the vaccine development. So this time, this is unprecedented, very unusual, never happened before for a few reasons. First, the infrastructure was already there. The second point has been that the SARS and the MERS coronaviruses, they left some messages that we exploited very effectively. And therefore, I think the speed and the progress we are making so far for the vaccine development is down to the early preparedness in terms of funding and the infrastructure availability and the knowledge we have gathered so far from the cousin-related viruses.
As an expert who's working tirelessly in the procedure of this, working towards developing a vaccine, do you see any or foresee any major roadblocks in the process of this? Withstanding that this vaccination itself is found, in implementing it, in trying to make it accessible, widespread?
Precisely. I think as we are now in this pandemic, a lot of hopes are there with the vaccine. Unfortunately, vaccines are not an immediate solution. As some of you already know, that the vaccines are progressing very well in terms of their development into different stages for the clinical trial. There are at least 35 candidates that are at different stages of development and the validation process. And yesterday, the first volunteer trial has been conducted in Seattle with Moderna, which is one of the mRNA vaccine. So people are progressing very effectively, including my group. We are at different stages in the laboratory validation. We are doing an extensive job to really bring the things up into the front. But yet, whatsoever the effort we will make, I would be cautious to say that our vaccine would not become available for this round of infection. Although we are not hoping that this virus would come back, but as it stands, it seems like having very unique features for sustaining in the population. We might have this re-emergence of this infection once it is eliminated from the globe in the near future. If that happens, so we will certainly have a vaccine available. But during that time, I think the major emphasis should be on to either therapeutics and for sure onto the personal hygiene and changing the personal behavior to really buy the time to develop these therapeutics and vaccine.
Right. Dr. Munir, I want to jump back to what you said, but before that, I want to pull in Mr. Azmat Majeed. Mr. Majeed, as we hear other individual practices, hygiene is of utmost importance during this crisis, but what other things can be done as this vaccination process is being accelerated, as a vaccine is being developed, especially in terms of boosting our immunity?
The foremost thing is regarding vaccine that I would like to say a few words about that we must make sure that all safety concerns are addressed before FDA licenses a vaccine. It is so paradoxical that as vaccines have become more available, public concerns about their safety have increased.
Right.
So what is happening right now is there are shortcuts that are being adopted, which have never been adopted before. And I hope that we don't see an adverse outcome post-immunization. So this is a big concern because human papilloma virus, that case is, serves as a reminder to me that, things may not be as good as they seem on TV. It needs vaccine development is a time-consuming is a process, and all safety concerns must be fully addressed before such a vast-scale immunization is undertaken.
Dr. Majeed, stay with me on that point. I'm going to come back and talk about what can be done to boost up immunity. But since you put forward a point that I'm sure echoes across the medical community, let's take this question to Dr. Mohammed Munir. This must be a concern that a lot of people are voicing. Since the process has been accelerated and there is cutting of corners, we talked about this earlier as well, where there was an emphasis that this is being done on the administrative end. But also, before this becomes widespread, this vaccine, how is it determined and how is it completely verified that it will be safe?
FDA is one of the major regulating authorities that approve the vaccines to get into the community and for the mass application. And they have a very precisely and well-optimized set procedure and pipelines every vaccine has to follow, regardless how emergency or how urgency is it to really get the vaccine into the market. So people are trying on their own, like hiring first phase volunteer to test the vaccine or applying the vaccine into best model, although we haven't identified what would be the best model for this one, but people are using macaque monkeys or the mice and so on. But whatsoever they would do, that would be on their own behalf as a researchers. Once they get all the approval from their own self that they are all fine with the vaccine has the efficacy, that it would effectively immunize the people and it would have a safety, there would not be any side effect, then the matter would go to the authorities, which will then have their own set procedure to follow. So whatever the vaccine that come into the market for mass application, they are passed through an exhaustive pipeline, and that is the reason that there is a massive time scale required for this vaccination. I do understand that there are some untoward effects or the side effects associated with some vaccine candidates, but this is really unfortunate and should not be any shortcut applied for especially in this scenario. Let me put into the perspective the vaccine that been first put into volunteers yesterday in Seattle. That is an mRNA vaccine that is not carrying any genetic information, or it carried the genetic information, but it does not carry any virus infectious particle by itself. And if this vaccine is applied into the human, the risk factor will relatively be low compared to like live vaccine or the attenuated vaccine, which have a chances that it would come back to infectious version. But still, they have skipped the animal testing in between, which is very unusual and should not be practiced. I fully buy the idea that we are in urgent need, but certainly all the procedure and not only the public health concern, but also the ethics would be considered, should be considered, and will have to be considered before vaccine.
How is this allowed in the animal testing stage?
This is down to the organization who are involved in developing the vaccine. It hasn't gone to the approval process yet. Once it goes to the approval process, they have to have that set protocol to follow. What researchers do before they go into the legal process, they do testing on their own so that their case would be more stronger and to be applied in the field. And one more thing to add is that although this became a new news for majority of the community because we are desperate in having the vaccine, this approach, the one that being tested or being tried yesterday, this is out there for last 20 years. We call it mRNA vaccine by Moderna company. For last 20 years, they've been trying to develop a vaccine and commercialize it. There is any single product in the market against any disease whatsoever they have done so far. So I'm really counting very positive that something would come up upfront, but we should not be, sit, rest, and take the thing so easily.
Right. Dr. Azmat Majeed, I said that I would come back to you on this, and this is one of the essential questions that keeps coming up, that till we find a vaccine, what a person can do is take individual measures, of course, social distancing and practicing of good hygiene, but also boosting their immunity. Can you take us through what can be done for that to happen?
I think the first and the foremost thing is, like as it is being advised on public TV all over the world, that we need to be more hygienic, we need to wash our hands more carefully, and we need to make sure that we don't come into contact with services which are exposed to public traffic and stuff like that. And the other thing is one's own immune system. And let me tell everyone here that it is the state of your immune system that would determine your response to this infection. And let me say one more thing. Every person in this world, probably except the few who are living in caves, they will get infected with this coronavirus. And just like influenza virus, every person would eventually be infected, and it would be determined by the condition of his immune system, that how he recovers or he succumbs to it, or there are issues that are life-threatening or not. So this is all dependent on the immune system. Now, what can we do to boost our immune system, or what can we do to make sure that we fare well against this fight of our life? The first and the foremost thing I would say is we need to get back to nature. We need to have a diet which doesn't engage our immune system adversely. We need to have less of preservative-laden foods and stuff like that, and we need to have more natural foods. And now coming to exact specific advice regarding what kind of nutrient can help us in our fight against this virus.
Right.
I would like to tell all the people that there are at least 5-6 nutrients that have shown in vitro and in vivo to be very effective against mRNA viruses. And these include Ebola, SARS, and this includes many other viruses of the same family. And these nutrients basically are olive leaves.
Right.
There's an extract that comes out of olive leaves called oleoperin, extremely effective. Then there's an extract that comes out of a plant that is called gymnema. Its extract is called gymnemic acid. It is easily available all over the world.
Right.
It is extremely effective against RNA viruses, the ones that keep on mutating, every step of the way. So there is another nutrient called astragalus. It has been used in US.
Dr. Majeed, on that point, thank you so much, Dr. Azmat Majeed, for joining us from Lahore, and Dr. Mohammed Munir for joining us from Lancaster. Now, there is an increasing demand for brain boosters and drugs that can enhance cognitive abilities. The reason why they're being used by many people across the world also is to address underlying mental health issues. Joining us to discuss more about this is Aleksandra Djuric, who joins us from Belgrade. She's a psychotherapist who will give us more insight as to what mental health issues can these drugs help. Thank you so much for joining us, Aleksandra, and welcome to the show. Now, when we talk about these brain boosters, neurotropics and the scientific name for them, what are some of the reasons why people use them?
Yes, we must understand that we are living in the competitive society. Unfortunately, I have a feeling that material things today and competitive society is equal to human values. And that is a really destructive thing for mental health, because we have young people who need to be more aggressive, more awake, more competitive, because they want to be more successful in this, unfortunately, material world.
Right. Aleksandra, now figures show that the reason why we're seeing such a spike in terms of consumption is because they're also being taken as antidepressants. What is the link between these brain booster drugs and depression?
Yes, as I said, we are living in a world where emotions, we have need to get away from our emotions, and that is not a good point to work on any part of society, because we need to be able to understand our emotional needs and to understand our current mental health. Antidepressives, they're used to as in some cases, of course, they must be used because we have a clinical depression. That is one thing. But the other thing is when we are using antidepressive as a way to deal with our emotions and a way to escape them. That is a different thing.
Right. Now, trying to just understand how should individuals seek these drugs, because we know that over-the-counter drugs have increased in the market, and that causes for many other problems to emerge. How should individuals seek this? Because there are online options, there are over-the-counter options. When and under which circumstances should individuals move towards nootropics?
Yes. I think that a person shouldn't be use any kind of drugs without medical consultant, because when we want to buy these kind of drugs, we can do that. We can go to pharmacist and explain our symptoms, and in some cases they can give us some kind of antidepressant. And sometimes we go to some person that they're not psychiatrists, they're not psychotherapists, they're not psychologists, they're they are doctors, but not in this area, and they just write you a prescription. I think that is a really dangerous thing, because mental health issue is a complex thing. And I'm really against drugs.
Right. Thank you so much, Aleksandra Djuric, for joining us and providing us more insight on this. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.